In this video, we will learn how our voice and instruments were used in classical music, as well as the music that led up to the classical style. Humans have been using our voice and instruments to make music since the dawn of time. However, the ways in which classical composers combined voices and different instruments together had a huge impact on the sound of classical music during each of its periods. So, in other words, each period of classical music was shaped by the instruments the composer used and how they were grouped together. So, let's hop in our mental time machine and go back 1,000 years to the medieval times. Vocal music ruled. Anything important was written for the church. It was called chant. In the Middle Ages, Gregorian chant started off as music with just one voice or melody at a time. Well, after a couple hundred years of this, the monks and the priests were like, boring! So they added two voices at a time. Yes! But the two voices pretty much just copied each other. Then someone said, wait, what if the two voices did something different? Wow! And polyphony was born. Yes! In the Middle Ages, polyphonic music had two or more melodies happening at the same time. Now, the only instrument allowed in the church during the Middle Ages was the organ. And like I said before, church music was important because monks had invented a way of writing music down so that it could be shared. So, picture wandering minstrels, storytellers, and poets in the streets playing love songs and dance music. But we don't know what that music sounded like. It was never written down. We do know that these street musicians would compose and improvise music on string instruments like the harp, the lute, which is similar to the guitar, the hurdy-gurdy, which was a stringed instrument that you had a crank that you had to turn and had buttons that you push down to change the notes, and the viol, which was similar to a violin. Woodwind instruments during the Middle Ages were the recorder and other flute-like instruments. Brass instruments during the Middle Ages were the shawm, which is similar to a trumpet, the bagpipes, and the sackbut, which is similar to the trombone. Popular percussion instruments were drums, cymbals, triangles, and tambourines. These string, woodwind, brass, and percussion instruments were used for dance music. During the Middle Ages, it was popular for street musicians to play stringed instruments like the hurdy-gurdy or lute and sing love songs through the villages. Now, during the Renaissance, music was still being written mainly for the church, and it was becoming more complex. Previously, Gregorian chant was one note at a time, and then two simple melodies at a time. But by the Renaissance, polyphony was super complex. Church composers had lots of singers singing lots of different parts that intertwined and echoed in the cathedral, and it was pretty cool sounding, but pretty difficult to follow the words. Church music was still by far the most important and complex music of its day, but music for entertainment was starting to grow in popularity. Parties and feasts would include madrigal singers. During the Renaissance, madrigal singers would perform love songs or light-hearted music without any instruments to accompany them. They were like the original pentatonic singers of their day. Many madrigal groups still exist today and perform around holidays. Parties and feasts would also include dancing, which was accompanied by instruments. The instruments that were used were basically the same as in the Middle Ages. However, one pretty cool fact is that there were basically two types of concerts: indoors and outdoors. Indoor concerts used the quieter instruments, and outdoor concerts used the louder instruments. It didn't matter what songs they played, they would switch instruments to adjust to the crowd. Kind of like how we have like remixes today or like acoustic versions of songs. During the Renaissance, different instruments began to be grouped together. This would later develop into the orchestra, but not quite yet. Having these instruments played together increased not only the volume of the music, but also the range of high and low pitches. Next, we get to the Baroque period. The Baroque period officially starts what we would consider classical music. Even though we're in the Baroque period. Confusing, I know, but just think of it as this way. During the Baroque era, the music starts to take on the shape of what classical music sounds like. Composers still composed classical music during the Romantic period. It just sounded different. It's like listening to rock and roll from 1950s and then listening to rock and roll from the 1980s, say Elvis Presley and AC/DC. Both different, but they have enough in common to be considered rock and roll. Anyway, during the Baroque era, composers still wrote for the church, but they started to combine singing along with instruments. Singers would sing, dance, and act out a story, while instruments made the story more dramatic in the background. And then, boom! Opera and ballet were born 400 years ago. During the Baroque period, composers started grouping instruments together that resembled an early orchestra. Instrumentation was not random like it was in the past. No indoor or outdoor instruments. The composer was specific, assigning certain instruments to play certain parts. Typically, the harpsichord player or violinist would act as the conductor for the group and direct the music. Another cool thing composers started doing was featuring a soloist along with the orchestra. The soloist was often a violinist or harpsichord player. These pieces were called concertos, but more on that in our next video. Now, the pipe organ and harpsichord were the most important keyboard instruments during the Baroque period. They were super popular. Now, pipe organs need air to be blown through them in order to work. The pipes are all different lengths and make different high and low notes, pitches. Now, early organs needed someone to keep air pumping through them. Imagine like an accordion. If you press the buttons on an accordion, it doesn't make a sound. But if you pump the folds in and out with your arms and press the buttons, you're pushing air through it. And you're changing the sound. Well, pipe organs need a lot of air to work. Luckily, people invented a motor to keep the air circulating so the organ could play without someone physically pumping the air. I bet that person's arm was getting tired. Ugh. Anyway, moving on. The harpsichord has keys like a modern-day piano. However, when the performer presses a key, the strings are struck by quills to make a sound. A quill is the stiff part of a feather. And the harpsichord had a very light and crisp sound and couldn't play loud or soft. It only had one volume. Now, during the Baroque period, the violin became the most important string instrument. Violin makers like Stradivarius built high-quality instruments that are still collected today. Other important string instruments were the viol, double bass, and the lute. Woodwind instruments like oboes, flutes, and bassoons were most common. Brass instruments like the trumpet, horn, and sackbut were used. Percussion instruments primarily consisted of timpani drums and aren't really used that much. Then we come to the classical period. About 300 years ago, a new and exciting sound popped up. The sound of the pianoforte. It literally means soft, loud. The pianoforte allowed players to make quiet and loud sounds on it, depending on how hard performers pressed the keys. This may not sound like a big deal to you, but this was huge. Before the pianoforte, the harpsichord was insanely popular. but it could only play at one volume. Cool, but not that cool. Keyboard music was able to become more expressive because of the pianoforte. The pianoforte is similar to what we think of when we hear a modern piano being played. So, composers started writing a lot more music for the piano. Like, a lot. They wrote for solo piano, piano and singers, piano with the orchestra, you name it. Because the piano could play soft and loud, composers started using more dynamics in their music. Before this, they would simply add more instruments to play loud parts of the music and remove some instruments to play the quiet parts. During the classical period, composers explored new groupings of instruments, like string quartets. Woodwind instruments were better quality and were used more to play melodic lines. The symphony orchestra started to resemble what it looks like now, as composers used the string, woodwind, brass, and percussion instruments. The string family consisted of violins, violas, cellos, and basses. The woodwinds consisted of flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons. The brass family had horns and trumpets. And the percussion family used timpani. Instrumental music was becoming more important than in the past, and the orchestra kept growing in size. Now, singers loved performing in operas, which were very popular during the classical period. However, some singers also enjoyed performing shorter songs called lied for smaller audiences. Next, we get to the Romantic era, and the Romantic era gives us more of the same, and I mean more. 200 years ago, during the Romantic era, the search for personal expression and emotion led composers to more instruments in the orchestra, larger performances, and longer compositions. One opera would even take about 17 hours to perform. Whew. Thanks a lot, Richard Wagner. Ugh. Composers wanted more intense sounds, so they added woodwind instruments like the piccolo and contrabassoon, and more brass instruments like horns, more percussion instruments like triangles, cymbals, and xylophones and bass drums, and all these instruments were so loud, so composers needed to add more stringed instruments to even out the sound. During the Romantic era, conductors became necessary to lead such large groups. Composers were becoming very creative with how to group these instruments together and create new and colorful sounds. This is called orchestration. Now, think back to the Baroque and classical periods. The string family usually played the melody. Sometimes the woodwinds were given the melody, but most often woodwinds and brass played accompaniment parts, or supporting roles. And this was in part due to the quality of woodwind and brass instruments. Before the 1800s, it was harder to play difficult and technical parts on woodwind and brass instruments. But during the 1800s, they invented valves that made brass instruments easier to play. Valves are buttons that change the length of the tube and change the pitch. And keys were added to woodwind instruments, making them easy to play. Keys made it easier to open and close the holes on woodwind instruments. So, thanks to the Romantic era, woodwind and brass musicians played more important roles in the orchestra because their instruments became easier to play. The instrument families were treated equally within the symphony. Any instrument could play the melody or supporting roles. Now, during this time, the saxophone was invented, and although it never really became a popular fixture in the symphony orchestra, the saxophone would later dominate jazz music. However, during the Romantic era, virtuosic performers became rock stars of the day. A virtuoso is someone who is very talented at what they do. A showman, the best of the best. And piano and violin virtuosos would tour and wow their audiences. The piano was a hugely popular instrument during the Romantic era. In fact, people started having music rooms in their homes, and it was very common for non-professional musicians to learn to play the piano. Opera singers enjoyed rock star-like status as they entertained huge audiences during the Romantic era. And finally, the contemporary period, or the 20th century. In the 20th century, electronic instruments were introduced. The synthesizer gave composers endless tones and possibilities. In the 20th century, composers manipulated or changed the sound of everyday instruments to get new sounds. During the contemporary era, composers changed the sound of the piano by putting items like screwdrivers and rags inside of them. Children, do not try this at home. Composers used mutes inside of brass instruments to change its timbre or tone. In the 20th century, records and phonograph players allowed people to listen to music without having to go to a live performance. People could enjoy classical music sitting in the comfort of their own homes. They didn't have to go anywhere or learn to play an instrument to enjoy it. So, in summary, classical music was shaped by the instruments the composer used and how they were grouped together. In the Middle Ages, Gregorian chant started off as music with just one voice or melody at a time. In the Middle Ages, polyphonic music had two or more melodies happening at the same time. During the Middle Ages, it was popular for street musicians to play stringed instruments like the hurdy-gurdy or lute and sing love songs through the villages. During the Renaissance, madrigal singers would perform love songs or light-hearted music without any instruments to accompany them. During the Renaissance, there were basically two types of concerts: indoors and outdoors. Indoor concerts used quieter instruments, and outdoor concerts used louder instruments. During the Renaissance, different instruments began to be grouped together. This would later develop into the orchestra, but not quite yet. Sorry, Renaissance. During the Baroque period, composers started grouping instruments together that resembled an early orchestra. Go Baroque! The pipe organ and harpsichord were the most important keyboard instruments during the Baroque period. During the Baroque period, the violin became the most important string instrument. The pianoforte allowed players to make quiet and loud sounds depending on how hard performers pressed the keys. During the classical period, composers explored new groupings of instruments like string quartets. During the classical period, the symphony orchestra started to resemble what it looks like now as composers use the string, woodwind, brass, and percussion families. Yes! 200 years ago, during the Romantic era, the search for personal expression and emotion led composers to more instruments in the orchestra, larger performances, and longer compositions. During the Romantic era, conductors became necessary to lead such large groups. Thanks to the Romantic era, woodwind and brass musicians played more important roles in the orchestra because their instruments became easier to play. The piano was hugely popular during the Romantic era. Opera singers enjoyed rock star-like status as they entertained huge audiences during the Romantic era. In the 20th century, electronic instruments were introduced. In the 20th century, composers manipulated or changed the sound of everyday instruments to get new sounds. And in the 20th century, records and phonographs allowed people to listen to music without having to go to